Okay, so from the tutorial video about creating the coin flip, we created this very basic coin flip app where when you run, you can see that it changes the coin and it will do heads or tails. Okay, so what we actually want to do now is we're going to make this a little bit better. We're going to make this so that it will repeat. So we can actually say, and we're going to do something called for in range. So for I in range, I'm going to do a bracket. So what I'm basically saying is this is how many times I want you to repeat this. So I'm going to do 6, and then I do colon, and what this does is it creates a loop for us. So this is a for loop, and then I just tab all these across. Now a slightly quicker way of tabbing across, you can select and then tab across. So it's a nice quick tip for you there on how to tab across quicker. And what happens with this program is it basically will loop this several times. So look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So we've got 6 instances where this is repeated. And the reason you do that is because if I did 1, you've got to sit there and keep pressing it over and over again, when I could just simply do 200 and then run it, and it runs it 200 times for me. So very quick, very easy, and that's part of the reason why coding is so important, because we can automate simple tasks. We can automate things that we don't need to sit there and count how many times it's been heads and tails. Okay, so the issue with this though, if I said 200, you would still have to go through and count them, wouldn't you? And that's the problem. This is where we can get even more clever with our coding. So if I just keep this as 6, okay, now at the moment we could quite happily count that, but as you saw with the 200 it might be a bit harder. Now we're going to add a new variable. Now the new variable we're going to add is called heads. We're going to set to 0 and tails equals 0. Now the reason we're adding these is because we're going to use these variables, and I'm going to show you how. So if we said heads here, so when this lands on heads, you do heads equals heads plus 1. Okay? So what that will do is as it works through, it will slowly add up all the amount of heads and all the amount of tails, which means that we can then use that later on. So if I then said tails equals tails plus 1, what this will do is it will allow me to put heads and tails in there. So if I run this, it hasn't told me what that is yet because I haven't asked it to print yet, but it's added them in the background. So let's actually get access to those variables now. So we can do print heads, print tails. Okay, so it's got 3 and 3. So if I did it again, 2 and 4, 6 and 0, 5 and 1, 3 and 3, etc, etc. Doesn't really help me though because it hasn't added the information for me because I don't know what each of them are. So we can add a name for them. So heads has landed, and then we can say plus the heads variable plus, I'm just going to have times at the end, like so. And then I'll add the same to this, so I can do, let's say tails has landed, and then I'll plus times, and then I'll do my space here. So if we run that, so what you'll notice when you run this is you get an error, and the reason you get an error is because you're trying to add a string to an int, so this is the wrong data type. Now what we can do is we can do something that's called casting, and this is basically where you change a value into another data type so that you can display it. And to do that you just simply type str, which stands for string, and put it in brackets. And what that means is it converts that integer, that int, because it's a number at the moment, into a string. It then means that when I push run, it then adds it so that I can see that it's a number, but it's just displaying it as a string. So it's still an int up here, but it's a string down here. So that's a way of getting around that error. So it means that I can keep running this, etc. and you'll see that it randomly changes. To make it even better, we're going to add rounds, which means that the user can then determine how many times the coin could be flipped or should be flipped. So we're going to add a variable called rounds, and we're going to say it's equal to 0. And then we're also going to add, actually let's change that to 2, so it's always got an amount that it's always going to be. And we're going to say rounds equals input, so this is what the user is going to put in, so the information they're going to put. So how many times should the coin be flipped? Let's say. So that's basically going to go down to here, and we need to change this 6 here to rounds. Now if we run that, and I put, say, 6 in there, you notice that there's an error here. Now the reason there's an error is because when you write something in an input, it automatically assumes that it's a string, so it writes it as a string. But what we can do is if we put int at the start here, we're basically saying that the int, so the number, is the user input, and how many times should the coin be flipped. Now you have to remember to put a bracket at the end, because if you don't put a bracket at the end, it's going to put another error in there. So if we run this, how many times should I flip the coin? Let's say 50. Hit enter. And then we can see here that it's collected the data and heads. So head has landed 22 times and tails has landed 28 times. So it means that we can create a program that essentially determines what are the chances of a coin landing heads or tails. So you can see that it's around 49% chance of heads, 51% chance of tails. But that information changes. So you can see that it's around that kind of 50% chance. So there's no guarantee that there's a 50-50% chance. There's around 54% chance in this case. But the more times you do it, you might find different results. So let's say if we did it for... make sure I type in the right place. So let's say if we change this to 2000. It takes a minute to load because it's running quite a lot of simulations. So you have to give it a chance to finish its calculations basically. And then once it's finished that, it will then tell you what the output is. So it's really important that you allow it to do these sorts of things. It does take longer to do this because it is a much longer equation and sequence. So I just skipped ahead there. So it does take a lot longer to calculate 2000, but you can see that it has calculated it in total the amount of times for us. So imagine having to do that all manually yourself. By doing it in a program, it means that it can calculate it and it can do it much quicker than you would be able to do it manually doing it. So I hope you found that tutorial video helpful and that you feel a little bit more confident with using Python to solve some examples of real-world problems.